Chapter 3: Muslim Jihad and Black Africa. Introduction. In the preceding chapter, we examined the development of Arab Islam under indigenous Black African patronage and the dynamics of religious changes and exchanges that took place. We established how non-Muslim indigenous communities hosted non-kin Muslim groups and how the traditional environment acted as a safe haven for minority Muslim groups and a cultivating ground for the preservation and propagation of the Arab Islamic tradition. Among the things established previously is the fact that Africans appropriated Islamic religious sciences, although even chiefs who adopted Arab names, performed their prayers, and went on Hajj, remained cautious if not suspicious of the legal and political content of Islam. On the whole, the indigenous order held sway. Lamenting over the marginal position of Islam in Ashanti, an exasperated Muslim leader, Muhammad al-Gamba, died 1826, made the following statement revealing the frustration of Muslim inability to overthrow the old indigenous order. Al-Gamba starts by bemoaning the lack of help from other Muslim communities upcountry, as a result of which he declares, "Believers are checked in their efforts to propagate God's worship by dint of arms." Had there been any such help, every nation, down to the seacoast itself, would have been converted to the service of Allah long before this, and the Quran would have been known throughout Africa, whereas now the idolaters are strong in the south. The Kumasi Alim's frustration was apparently fueled by the fact that some Muslim groups in other parts of the sub-region had succeeded in invoking the doctrine of jihad to overthrow the indigenous system. One such jihad movement was that of Uthman Dan Fodio, died 1817, of 19th century present-day northern Nigeria, which will be discussed later in this section. Writing on Dan Fodio's jihad, Umar Abdullahi states that Abdullahi Dan Fodio, died 1828, Uthman Dan Fodio's brother and chief ideologue of the northern Nigerian jihad tradition, was disappointed by the first peaceful method of changing the old order and found he was duty-bound to overthrow the said old order intellectually and militarily. In other words, some Muslims became increasingly convinced that military jihad was the only alternative means if Islam was to triumph over the old indigenous order, as peaceful exchanges had failed. Our intention in this section is to examine the key trends of military jihad, mainly as a Muslim religious duty and a response to or reaction to the indigenous African environment and its values during the 18th and 19th centuries. Our main aim here is, first of all, to highlight the classical Muslim doctrine of jihad in Sunni Islam. We shall endeavor to focus mainly on those aspects of the doctrine that are relevant to the African situation. This background is crucial in our estimation not only because it will throw some light on the doctrinal basis of the campaigns in Black Africa, but also because of the enigmatic nature of the doctrine in contemporary times. Second, we will trace and highlight the historical background to the theory of military jihad within the sub-Saharan African context. Third, we will briefly highlight some jihad movements that took place in sub-Saharan Africa in an attempt to analyze the socio-religious and political dynamics underlying the campaigns. Fourth, we will examine the jihadist attitude toward indigenous African believers and their customs. This we shall endeavor to do by critically analyzing the main reasons or causes of the jihad movements as advanced by the activists themselves. The alternative program the jihadists sought to enforce will then be examined, followed by a brief evaluation of the jihad tradition in tropical Africa. Sunni Muslim doctrine of jihad. The definition of jihad has become something of an enigma since the beginning of the 20th century due to various factors. These include the fact that, first, the term jihad has a rather wide range of meanings and lends itself to differing interpretations and emphasis. Second, Muslim sources such as the Quran and Sunnah are themselves not immediately clear on the subject. Third, early and modern intra-anti-Muslim polemics and apologetics have added to the enigma. Jihad is the Arabic verbal noun derived from the verb jahada, which means strain, exertion, endeavor, etc., on behalf or for the sake of something. Jihad is translated by E.W. Lane as the using or exerting one's utmost power efforts, endeavors, or ability in contending with an object of disapprobation, namely a visible enemy, the devil, and oneself. Lane goes on to point out that jihad came to be used by Muslims to signify fighting or waging war against unbelievers and the like as a religious duty. Muslims of the mystical Sufi tradition and other modern Muslim apologists tend to emphasize the esoteric meaning of the term by insisting that jihad against one's sinful inclinations, jihad bi al-nafs, is the greater jihad, while military jihad against non-Muslims is the lesser jihad. This is claimed to be based on a saying of Muhammad on his return from a military expedition to the effect that we are returning from the lesser jihad to the greatest jihad. This claim is countered in another prophetic tradition which says, "Whosoever among you sees anything blameworthy shall alter it with this hand, jihad of the sword, jihad bi al-sayf. If he cannot do this, he shall do it with the tongue, preaching jihad, jihad al-qawl. If he cannot do this, he shall do it at heart, jihad against one's sinful inclinations, jihad bi al-nafs. This is the least that religion demands." Quranic stipulations on the subject itself range from verses that enjoin Muslims to be tolerant toward non-Muslims to those that permit Muslims to fight and slay unbelievers who persecute them, to verses that instruct Muslims to make war upon non-Muslims wherever ye find them, until or unless they repent and establish worship and pay the poor dues, in what has come to be known as the sword verse. Classic Muslim thought tried to reconcile these apparently conflicting texts through the doctrine of nashk, or abrogation, by which the generality of classical Muslim thought maintains that Quranic verses which sanction all-out warfare against non-Muslims recited during the latter years of Muhammad's life in Medina overrule those that stipulate peaceful and pacifist coexistence recited during the earlier years of Muhammad's mission in Mecca. As a result, the sword verse is said to have abrogated a large number of verses in the latter category. The legal interpretation of jihad in mainstream Sunni jurisprudence is fighting the unbelievers by striking them, taking their property, demolishing their places of worship, smashing their idols and the like. Ever since, the term jihad, when used without qualification, has always meant the fighting of non-Muslims for the sake of Islam or in the service of Allah. Two main categories of non-Muslims are identified in relation to jihad, i.e., outright unbelievers, such as adherents to primal religions, and people of the book, which includes Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. With regard to the kuffar, traditional Sunni jurists, with the exception of Malik ibn Anas, agree that they have three options when a jihad is declared on them: conversion to Islam, enslavement, or death. Malik left the fate of the kuffar to the discretion of the Muslim conqueror, emir, who is at liberty to kill, enslave, or exact taxes from them. It will become clear as we proceed how African advocates of jihad invoke the classical rulings on the fate of the kuffar in relation to traditional African believers. As far as the Al-Kitab, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians are concerned, they have the option of conversion to Islam or subjugation under Islamic rule as protected minorities, or dhimmi. Wars between different groups of Muslims were never regarded as jihad, at least according to the theory of general Sunni doctrine, even though many such wars were branded as such. There is even hesitation in referring to the struggle against renegade groups in Islam as jihad. The Sisides, largely of Persian origin, who emerged against the background of early intra-Muslim political schism in about 661 CE, became known, among other things, for their reactionary and militant Puritanism. The Khawarij declared all other Muslims who did not subscribe to their view as unbelievers. In contrast to the Sunni position, which was at this stage identified with the political interest of the Quraysh, Muhammad's tribe, the Khawarij held that the commission of major sins renders a Muslim, especially the ruler, an unbeliever who becomes a legitimate target of jihad. The Khawarij instituted jihad as the sixth pillar of Islam and became a source of constant insurrections against the Khalifa on account of what they saw as un-Islamic practices of the rulers. They were ruthlessly suppressed, but by no means exterminated, and most of their thoughts survived in North Africa, Oman, in Eastern Arabia, and East Africa, where they persist in the more modern, moderate form of the Ibadiyya. The mainstream Islamic doctrine of jihad, like most other dogmas, was largely formulated against the background of intra-Muslim political squabbling and in direct response to the Khawarij challenges. The Sunni position maintained that no Muslim becomes an unbeliever on account of sin. Ruling as to when a Muslim becomes an unbeliever was declared a divine prerogative, suspended until the Day of Judgment. This position, known as the Morija, postponement, was developed to the effect that the murder of a fellow Muslim is highly reprehensible. Mainline Sunni Islam goes on to stipulate that the ruler or imam had the sole prerogative of declaring a legitimate jihad and called for total obedience to the ruler and or the imam under every circumstance. A prophetic tradition was found to buttress this position. Obey whoever is put in authority over you, even if he be a crop-nosed Ethiopian slave. This political quietism was, however, more theory than practice. In fact, the emphasis on political quietism only serves as a reflection of the tensions that characterize Muslim rule, as it did other medieval political systems. Nevertheless, the principle was quite clear, and it is important to bear the Sunni and Khawarij stances in mind, for they will be instructive when we come to examine the position of the West African jihadists and their fellow Muslim opponents. The Sunni doctrine of jihad is embedded in the traditional Muslim juridical division of the world into Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, in which Islamic government and law prevailed, and Dar al-Harb, the House of War, where infidel rulers remain in power. Certain territories were regarded as falling into an intermediate category between the House of Islam and House of War. These are variously designated as Dar al-Sulk, the House of Truce, or Dar al-Ad, the House of Pact or Covenant. These territories were normally in a tributary or subordinate relationship to the House of Islam, whose governments made a commitment to guarantee safe passage and or temporary residence for Muslims. Between the House of Islam on the one side and the Houses of War and Pact or Covenant on the other, there is a morally necessary, legally, and religiously obligatory state of war that can only be interrupted at Muslim expediency by a truce of limited duration, but not by a peace treaty, until the final and inevitable triumph of Islam over non-Islam. This is because Islam is not just a religion but a revolutionary ideology and program which seeks to alter the social order and rebuild it in conformity with its own tenets and ideals. Permanent Muslim residence in non-Muslim territory is discouraged, and in most cases strongly condemned on the basis of Quran 4 with the support of a number of hadiths. The only option for Muslims with a conscience and the means living in Dar al-Harb is hijrah or migration, in keeping with the prophetic example, Uswa Kahsana, to prepare for military jihad against such a system. Jihad is, therefore, a necessary religious duty to which a Muslim dedicates himself in the service of God. The final jihad will be waged by the Mahdi, the expected divinely guided one, who will come at the end of time to establish Islam conclusively. There is no consensus as to the actual understanding of jihad amongst the contemporary modern Muslim scholars. There are those who hold the view that jihad is permitted only in self-defense and was never meant or used as a means to spread Islam. They emphasize the Quranic verse that there is no compulsion in religion, the esoteric meaning of the term as a spiritual and moral struggle, and present the wars fought by the Prophet of Islam in 7th century Arabia as provoked and therefore defensive. Mahmoud Saltut, former rector of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, writing on jihad, argues that the message of Islam is a simple and easy one, containing no elements opposed to human nature, and speaks for itself enough to require any further means to enlist adherents. Shaltut concludes, from his own interpretations of the verses of fighting in the Quran, that there is not a single verse in the Quran which could support the opinion that the aim of fighting in Islam is conversion. But there are those Muslim scholars and activists who, however, regard such interpretations as false and insist that the aim of fighting in Islam is raising God's word on earth, both by attacking and by defense, because Islam was spread by the sword, and there should be no apologies whatsoever for that. Jihad. Theories and campaigns in Africa. As has been intimated in the previous chapter, the introduction of Islam in tropical Africa, unlike North Africa, was mainly through the activities of Muslim merchants and religious experts. There have, nevertheless, been instances where war and raids were waged against traditional believers in the name of jihad. Militant Islamization was carried out by the Sanhaja, who were inspired by the Murabitun, Almoravid movement, founded by Abd Allah bi Yassin, died 1059, early in the 11th century. The Murabitun conducted raids into the Sahel, the shore of the desert, in the 11th century. According to Ibn Khaldun, the Sanhaja triumphed over the Sudanese, plundered their territories, imposed tribute and poll tax, and forced many of them to join Islam. The Sanhaja Almorid dynasties were overthrown by the Muwahidun, loosely translated as Unitarians, of the Znaga. The Mansas, or rulers of Mali, regarded themselves as Muslims, and one of the most celebrated rulers, Mansa Musa, 1312 to 1337, is said to have performed an ostentatious pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 to 1325. Mali's rulers conducted raids and fought wars, but they had not the remotest idea of Islamization as an intended objective, nor are the wars described as jihad. The seeds of militant Islamization in the form of jihad in the heart of tropical Africa found its socio-political seedbed when Songhai eclipsed Mali in the mid-15th century. Soni Ali, regarded as the founder of the Songhai Empire, certainly regarded himself as a Muslim, and indeed did observe the Muslim prayers, fasted, and gave alms. Soni Ali, however, found himself in the dilemma of most African rulers of the time, who tried to keep an uneasy balance between the traditional order to which they owed their authority and the comprehensive applications of Arab Islam. In the words of Lamin Saneh, the dilemma of Soni Ali under such circumstances is a classic one. He had adopted the religion, observed its tenets in a haphazard fashion, and encouraged its propagation under official direction. Yet he perceived that Islam in its irreducible Arabic scaffolding raised the spectre of being a state within a state. Soni Ali did not seek to impose Islam as a state policy. He is said to have been harsh in his treatment of the largely Sanhaja Muslim divines of Timbuktu, apparently because he regarded them as sympathizers of the Tuareg, whom he had conquered. Mohammed Toure, a general and governor, or farmer, in the Soni's administration in 1493, eventually overthrew Ali's dynasty. Askia Mohammed, as he came to be known, was a Soninke and not a native Songhai, which meant that he had no legitimate claim to the throne. In an apparent attempt to depart from Ali's legacy, Askia Mohammed, from the outset of his rule, espoused Islam as a state policy and adopted a process of appeasement toward the Muslim divines of Timbuktu. Having no legitimate claim to the throne, Askia Mohammed could not count on the indigenous community for support and had to seek this from the largely immigrant Muslim community. Askia Mohammed's policy, according to J.O. Hunwick, was to take advantage of Islam as a positive factor in government, using the Muslim establishment to give his rule proper legitimacy. To this end, he not only paid flattering attention to the Muslim scholars of Timbuktu in particular, receiving them on terms of intimacy and even visiting them in Timbuktu, but also showed special respect to returning pilgrims and to visiting sharifs. The Askia's example was to be reenacted in the Western and Central Sudan some 3 centuries later, with the largely immigrant Muslim rising up in arms against the non-Muslim indigenous population. These uprisings proved successful in some areas, leading to the takeover of the reins of power in the name of Islam. Abd al-Karim al-Maghili and the concept of jihad in Africa. Askia undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca and is said to have received an insignia from the Khalifa in Cairo, who appointed him as an emir to rule the lands of Takrur. It was, however, due to his administration for returning pilgrims and sharifs that Askia Mohammed came into contact with Abd al-Karim al-Makili, died 1505, a Tunisian jurist who was to become the authoritative proponent of jihad in tropical Africa. Al-Maghili is well known in North African sources as a militant activist whose anti-Jewish pogroms led to the massacre of Jews in Tuat and Gurara in the late 15th century. The Jews were an economically influential dhimmi, and al-Maghili launched a campaign to have them pay the jizya, which, in his view, is intended to enforce degradation and humility upon them in the manner of speech and action, their entire condition, until they come under tramp of the foot of every Muslim man and Muslim woman, freeborn or slave. The best way of achieving this humiliation was by denouncing their religion and forcing them to conceal it and bury its teachings. Al-Maghili declared the Jews chief enemies of Muhammad and Islam and proclaimed that to kill a single Jew is more rewarding than waging a war in the land of polytheists. Al-Maghili was mainly against muwalat, maintaining friendly relations with non-Muslims, in this case Jews. In one of his numerous treatises, he cites a host of Quranic verses and traditions to the effect that every true believer must be severe against the unbelievers, for it is one of the signs of love for the Prophet that we should hate those who are hated by God or the Prophet and become hostile to those who are enemies of God and the Prophet. All those Muslims who are associated with non-Muslims in general, and Jews and Christians in particular, are unbelievers by association, because it is only a person who has no religion, sense and integrity that will bring an unbeliever near to himself or his family or put some of his wealth in his hands. Al-Maghili's views and militancy did not go down well with the leading ulama and rulers of the time, and he became increasingly regarded as an unwelcome troublemaker intent on usurping power in the region. He found himself less a hero in Tuat than he had imagined, and decided to move further down into the Bilad al-Sudan, where he was to be canonized as a pious, authoritative alim and a reformer imbued with barakah, whose name in a silsila, traditional Muslim curriculum vitae, became very desirable. Al-Maghili set out for Kano in present-day northern Nigeria, with whose ruler, Muhammad Rumfa, he was already corresponding, and then finally to Gao in about 1502, where he came into contact with Askia Mohammed. Askia Mohammed had apparently inquired from Al-Maghili about issues relating to government, scholars and state, tajdid or religious reform, and theories of jihad. Askia Mohammed wanted assurance that his overthrow of Sani Ali, a professing Muslim ruler, was in consonance with Islamic teachings. With regard to the local ulama, some of whom seemingly condemned the Askia's action, the Askia alleged that they understand no Arabic except a little of the speech of the Arabs of their towns, in an incorrect and corrupted fashion. Al-Maghili then ruled that these were venal scholars who falsely devour people's wealth and debar folk from God's way. The Askia should have nothing to do with them, and jihad against them and their supporters is more worthy than any other jihad. Al-Maghili went on to hint at what was to become a central motivational factor to later African jihad movements, the traditional Muslim belief in a mujaddid, regenerator or reformer, expected at the beginning of every century to call erring Muslims back onto the right path. This millenarian figure, in Al-Maghili's words, will be an odd man out because of the truth he would stand for as opposed to his contemporaries. On the question of Askia's overthrow of Sani Ali, Al-Maghili, referring to Surah 2, 26-27, assured him that Ali and all his supporters are no doubt among the most unjust oppressors and miscreants who cut asunder what God has ordained to be joined and commit mischief in the earth. So the Askia's jihad against them and his seizing of power from their hands is one of the most worthy and important of jihads. The Muslim jurist arrived at this ruling by employing the doctrine of takfir, anathematizing fellow believers. Three categories of unbelievers, in whose case a jihad was legitimate, were identified by Al-Maghili. First are outright unbelievers, like Christians, Jews, Magians, and those like them who inherited outright unbelief from their fathers. Second are Muslim apostates, murtad, while in the third group is the person who claims to be a Muslim and whom we adjudge to be an unbeliever because he has committed an outward action such as none but an unbeliever would. This was again a potent ruling that was to be employed and followed to its logical conclusion in 19th century West Africa. With regards to government, Al-Maghili ruled that in the case of an ungoverned land, Bilad Saiba, a land where Muslims live under non-Muslim rule, such Muslims should be summoned to pay homage, or bayah, to a lawful emir, and if they refuse, a jihad should be declared against that land. Similarly, a land whose ruler can be proven to be oppressive and has declared unlawful taxes to be lawful is a legitimate target of jihad against outright unbelievers. Fighting and killing such rulers and their supporters is not reprehensible, even if they pray and fast and pay zakat and perform the pilgrimage. Al-Maghili urged an end to such practices as Muslim divination, astrology, numerology, and the production of charms and amulets, commercial malpractice, non-observance of the seclusion of women from men, and the proper dressing of women. In other words, Al-Maghili called not only for jihad to extend the sway of Dar al-Islam, but also for the strictest implementation of the Sharia, an end he saw jihad as a legitimate and noble means of attaining. Throughout his replies, Al-Maghili uses jihad in connection with corrective or reformist activity, Chajid. As rightly pointed out by Hunwick, there is an unspoken assumption that the Askia as an Amir, governing a portion of the Islamic Ummah, would carry out the statutory jihad against Dar al-Harb. Al-Maghili's preoccupation with legitimizing fighting and killing of fellow Muslims should not be taken to mean he was not interested in fighting non-Muslims to spread Islam. Al-Maghili did not need to spend time elaborating on such a fundamental and non-disputable issue. The issue of his exposition of corrective jihad, nevertheless, is in three important ways at variance with the mainstream Sunni position and in consonance with the Khawariji position highlighted above. These are Al-Maghili's doctrine of takfir, which declared fellow Muslims as unbelievers on account of their deeds, his sanction of fighting and killing other Muslims as jihad, and his legitimization of jihad against Muslim rulers because of oppression. Mervyn Hiskett describes Al-Maghili's teaching as essentially those of Maliki fundamentalism. It is not surprising that Al-Maghili could have been influenced by Khawariji ideas for, as pointed out above, remnants of this sect survived in North Africa. Even though this remains to be proven, it is nevertheless suggestive. J.O. Hunwick suggests that Al-Maghili intended various types of jihad for various types of kufr, and that a distinction should be drawn between jihad of the hand, or bloodless jihad, and jihad of the sword. Hunwick's suggestion, though, is possibly too subtle. Nowhere in the text is it immediately or even remotely apparent that Al-Maghili's use of jihad is meant to be understood other than as jihad of the sword. Indeed, those jihadists like Uthman Dan Fodio and the rest, who were to quote him 3 centuries later as an authority on the legitimacy of jihad against fellow Muslims within the African context, did not make any such distinctions. Be that as it may, Askia Mohammed is known to have conducted numerous expeditions, one of which, the campaign against the Mossi in 1498 and 1499, has been singled out and explicitly referred to in local Muslim sources as the only proper jihad undertaken in the way of Allah in the Western Sudan. As to what extent Askia Mohammed saw himself as the Mujaddid of the 10th century of the Hijra is not clear. What is clear, however, is that local Muslim sources record that he was the 11th and last Mujaddid whose reign would be followed by that of the Mahdi and the subsequent end of the world. Despite legendary praises of the Askia in local Muslim sources, it is known that his program of reforms was largely cosmetic and did not go beyond the centers of authority. In fact, little attempt was made by the Askia and his successors to reform his administration in line with Sharia requirements or the actual practice of other Muslim countries. He maintained and even enlarged the Songhai system of titles and offices which he inherited from Soni Ali. Traditional practices continued at the court, and people appearing before him had to prostrate themselves and cover their heads with dust. Askia Mohammed, therefore, sought al-Makhili's views in order to legitimize his rule, but paid lip service to his militant and prescriptive ideas. These had to wait for 3 centuries to be turned into potent formulae for Muslim campaigns in West Africa. It is these campaigns we now proceed to examine. Jihad campaigns in Africa. The wave of military jihad in tropical Africa appeared in its major form in southern Mauritania in the 7th century. This was initiated by a certain Imam Nasir al-Din, died 1674, of the Sanhaja clan of the Berbers. Nasir directed his jihad at the imperial Arab ruling elite of present-day Mauritania. The jihad lasted for 4 years, 1673 to 1677, and soon spread from southern Mauritania into the present-day Senegambian region, mainly directed at traditional African peasant communities in areas such as Wallo, Futa Toro, and Kayo. Many of the Muslim clerical communities, Zawaya, refused to support Nasir al-Din's course, while his supporters portrayed him as the Mujadid. Nevertheless, Nasir's actions broke the tradition of Muslim religious pacifism and served as an immediate precursor for a number of Muslim divines who had preached Islam and, notwithstanding the fact that their religious preeminence had been acknowledged, had wished to further dominate the local Wolof people. As a direct result, a series of Muslim Fulbe and Tukulo campaigns ensued throughout the 18th century against the Wolof, the Jalonke, and Denaike dynasties during the early part of the 18th century. Most of the campaigns ravaged the region and plunged the area into wide-scale pillage and enslavement of hitherto prosperous traditional African communities. The campaigns were, however, largely unsuccessful in establishing any meaningful and effective Islamic rule, despite the resultant numerous almamates, the Fulani equivalent of sultanate. The campaigns also failed in converting people in any meaningful numbers to Islam. On the contrary, it filled the rulers of the region with suspicion and sometimes open antagonism towards the Muslim clerical elite, and drove traditional rulers further away from Islam than they had ever been in the preceding century. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a Fulbe cleric, Uthman Danfodio, died 1817, launched a jihad in Hausaland in present-day northern Nigeria. Danfodio, like most of his contemporaries, gained much influence through patronage from the Hausa ruling class of Gobir. He apparently taught royal members and was the tutor of Yunfa, the ruler of Gobir, in the early 1800s. He became something of a kingmaker, and his support for Yunfa is said to have won the latter the throne of Gobir in 1801. As we pointed out in the previous chapter, Muslim clerics exerted a lot of influence at traditional courts, albeit from the background, and Danfodio's influence is a typical example of the situation across sub-Saharan Africa at the time. This royal patronage provided Danfodio with some sort of immunity and enhanced his prestige to enable him to undertake preaching tours within the Hausa kingdoms, during which he attracted a considerable number of followers. He was moderate and criticized certain contemporary scholars, including his own teacher, who held on to austere conservatism. The turning point in Danfodio's life apparently came during a series of visions he claimed to have had. In one such vision, in 1794, he claimed to have met with the Prophet of Islam and Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, founder of the Qadiriya Sufi order. In the alleged vision, Abd al-Qadir dressed and enturbaned him as Imam of the Saints, then girded him with the sword of truth, Sayf al-Haq, to unsheathe against the enemies of God. These alleged visions apparently made Danfodio conceive of himself as the Mujadid of the century, whose coming heralded appearance of the Mahdi. His preaching brought about the wearing of turbans and veils by Muslim men and women respectively, a practice he had earlier condemned others for advocating. The adoption of non-Hausa lifestyles by an increasing number of Hausa people caused some amount of consternation among the Hausa ruling class. Nafata, then ruler of Gobir, 1794 to 1801, introduced laws banning all public preaching except that undertaken by Danfodio himself, and ordered a stop to the conversion of sons whose parents were themselves non-Muslims. All such converts were ordered to revert to the traditions of their fathers. The edict also banned the wearing of turbans and veils. Nafata was succeeded in 1801 by Yunfa, a former student of Danfodio, and relations between the new chief and Danfodio proved more difficult. The latter then undertook what he regarded as hijra, in line with Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE, to a village called Gudu in 1804. Danfodio's withdrawal, in the words of a modern Nigerian Muslim scholar, was to bring the Muslim community to the threshold of jihad. He, Danfodio, also envisaged the jihad which would follow almost immediately. So, sensing danger, Yunfa launched an attack on Danfodio and his community, but the attack was repulsed and the army of Gobir defeated. This was to be the beginning of a series of Fulbe military campaigns against the Hausa and other people groups in the area. Yunfa sent messages to other Hausa rulers of Katsina, Kano, and Zegzeg, Daura, and Ahir, warning them that he had neglected a small fire in his country until it had spread beyond his power to control. Having failed to extinguish it, it had now burnt him. Let each be aware, lest like a calamity befall his town also. But this was too late. Sokoto was established as the seat of the caliphate, as it came to be known, and Fulani adventurers visited Danfodio from different parts of the region to receive blessed flags to enable them to undertake local military campaigns in their localities. The Sokoto Jihad was opposed by leading Muslim scholars at Yandoto in northern Nigeria. The town was attacked and defeated by the jihadists. The campaigns came under severe doctrinal criticism from other leading Muslim scholars of the time, especially Muhammad Al-Amin Al-Kanimi, a highly respected alim of early 19th century Bornu, where Fulani subjects under the inspiration of Danfodio's jihad started hostilities against local rulers. Danfodio made an early retirement from political life, divided the empire between his son, Muhammad Bello, and his brother, Abdullahi Danfodio, and died in 1817. The flame of Muslim Fulani campaigns and raids on indigenous communities in areas of modern-day northern Nigeria, parts of southern Niger, and northwestern Cameroon, in the name of God, was carried on by his flag bearers and their successors until the British intervention in 1904. These campaigns resulted in the formation of a large number of separate, often hostile states, loosely acknowledging the titular suzerainty of the ruler of Sokoto. One of the many post-jihad Muslim Fulani apologia attributed to Danfodio cites works of past authorities to the effect that Sudan meant land of infidels, and that the few Muslims who lived and traded with these enemies were committing a disgraceful and reprehensible act. It goes on to quote at length a work of a celebrated 15th century Timbuktu alim, Ahmad Baba, and declares that Islam in Hausa land was widespread among other than kings. The kings are unbelievers and nothing else. It then makes the following declaration. The government of a country is the government of its king without question. If the king is a Muslim, his land is Muslim. If he is an unbeliever, his land is a land of unbelievers. In other words, the status of a land, being Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb, depended not on the beliefs of the majority of the subjects, but on that of the ruler. Danfodio, in another work, approvingly quotes from al-Makili thus: "It is not right for you, the Sultan, to leave a sinner in his sins, when you can save him from them by chiding, or imprecation, or binding him in prison, or beating, or by crucifixion and death, or by banishment, or by confiscation of his house, or by other chastisement imposed by the Sharia." In yet another post-jihad apologia, Danfodio decried, among other things, the traditional Hausa system of succession by hereditary right and the prevalence of traditional customs in the courts. He also accused the Hausa rulers of friendly relations with and the failure to undertake jihad against neighboring traditional believers. Other charges against the Hausa rulers included corruption, the imposition of non-canonical taxes, recruiting Muslims into armies, and the enslavement of Fulani people who, in Danfodio's view, were Muslim. Danfodio demanded the enforcement of the hijab, the hudud, or lashing, amputation, stoning, and death prescribed in Islamic law for various crimes such as adultery, theft, drinking alcohol, etc. Strict adherence to the observance of Islamic commercial laws, and a stop to the practice of drumming, singing, and dancing are judged as satanic innovation, bida shaitaniya. Al-Maghili's doctrine of takfir and kufr were employed by Danfodio to declare fellow Muslims unbelievers based on what they do or say. Thus, Al-Maghili's influence upon Danfodio, in the words of Louis Brenner, was significant, indeed central, for questions of takfir and kufr as they related to jihad and to social and political relationships in the caliphate. In an exchange of polemical correspondences, Al-Kanimi intimated that, serious and reprehensible as some of the allegations against the Hausa were, they were in no way peculiar to the sub-region. He pointed out that such practices could be found throughout other parts of the Muslim world and insisted that they did not render a person an unbeliever so long as his faith remains unbroken, even in disobedience, ma'asi. Furthermore, Al-Kanimi maintained that it was impossible, in a war situation, to differentiate a Muslim from a non-Muslim, and under such circumstances, the abandonment of the unbeliever is more acceptable than the killing of a Muslim. In other words, Al-Kanimi was restating the mainline Sunni Murji'a position delineated above, namely, that the ruling as to when a Muslim becomes an unbeliever or qualifies for jihad or to be killed is in the hands of God. Another major jihad after that of Danfodio was the jihad of Al-Hajj Umar Tal, died 1864, a Tukulor of Futa Turo in the Senegambian region. Al-Hajj Umar performed the Hajj in 1828, where he came under the influence of Muhammad Al-Ghani Abu Talib, the Tijani Khalifa for the Hijaz, who allegedly appointed him as Khalifa of the Tijaniya order for the Western Sudan. Upon his return in 1832, Al-Hajj Umar spent some time in Sokoto and married the daughter of Muhammad Bello, son and successor of Danfodio. Umar proceeded to Futa Jalon, where he established a Jama'ah of Tijani persuasion at Diaguku, attracting an increasing number of followers. Like those of Danfodio, Umar's preaching successes raised a sense of apprehension and suspicion from the Muslim Al-Mami of Futa Jalon, leading to the withdrawal of the latter and his Jama'ah in 1851 into a territory under non-Muslim African rule called Dingure. Here, Umar began to prepare his Jama'ah militarily by instituting a standing army and purchasing large quantities of arms and armaments. These acts alarmed the traditional ruler of the area, who launched what looked like a panic attack on the Jama'ah, presenting Al-Hajj Umar with the immediate context, or rather pretext, for his jihad. Al-Hajj Umar claimed to have had a vision, in which Allah informed me that I was authorized to undertake the jihad, and he repeated it 3 times. The jihad was launched in 1852 with the principal aim of conquering and converting the largely autochthonous non-Muslim people of the region to Islam. Umar's main targets were the Mandinka state of Tamba and the Bambara courts of Karta and Segu. His forces achieved some spectacular successes until they suffered a severe setback at the hands of French forces at Medine. At Segu, Umar's forces also came into confrontation with the Almamate of Masina, instituted through jihad by one of Danfodio's vassals, Ahmad Lobo, otherwise known as Ahmad of Masina. This Muslim-Muslim confrontation sparked off doctrinal debate, which assumed a Qadiri Tijani nature because of the Qadiri leanings of Ahmad Lobo and his mentor Ahmad al-Bakai al-Kunti. Ahmad al-Bakai strongly condemned claims that Umar was the Mujaddid, Mahdi, and a reincarnation of Jesus, claims that persisted long after his death among his followers. On the legitimacy and wisdom of Umar's jihad, al-Bakai wrote, "I am fully aware of the merits of jihad, but jihad leads to mulk, or worldly authority, and mulk leads to tyranny, zulm. Our present condition, as it is more suitable to us than indulgence in jihad, and more assuring to us for not having indulged in unlawful things which jihad would entail." Al-Bakai went on to outline the classical Muslim understanding of jihad. Jihad is to be strictly limited to fighting of infidels. If you contend otherwise, bring me an evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah to prove your assertion. It is the tyrant Muslims who are to be fought in order that the Sharia become established. And even this type of fighting has to be executed at the behest of the Imam al-Muslim. On the other hand, such fighting cannot be recognized as jihad, and the person who dies in the participation in such activity will not receive the honors of a martyr in jihad. Al-Hajj Umar, on his part, accused the Masina Muslim authorities of not only failing to embark upon jihad against the infidel indigenous communities, but of befriending the enemies of Allah, the enemies of all the Muslims, our enemies, his enemies, and the enemies of his forefathers. This controversy, like that between Al-Kanimi and the Sokoto rulers, ended inconclusively. However, Al-Bakai made a significant military contribution towards the eventual demise of Al-Hajj Umar and his political program by sponsoring a rebellion which led to the death of Umar in 1864 and the subsequent withering of his conquered territory. Another jihad of the period worth mentioning was that initiated by Samori Touré. Samori's jihad is of particular interest in that, unlike most of the other main jihadists, he was of the Mande and not Fulbe tribe. Samori was, unlike Danfodio and Al-Hajj Umar, a soldier by profession and non-literate. He launched his campaigns in 1870 in the region of present-day Guinea and the Ivory Coast, and claimed to be fighting for the Muslim cause ostensibly to protect Muslim trade from pagan taxes. This attracted a section of the Muslim trading communities into his jihad. Samori attacked and ransacked both Muslim and non-Muslim communities in the region until the French halted him in about 1898. As with most of the other jihadists, however, a significant proportion of the Muslim leadership opposed his campaigns because they were too firmly established, on too good terms with their largely indigenous neighbors, and made too good a living from trade to wish to upset the system. His defeat was a big relief to both Muslim and non-Muslim societies. A Muslim appreciation for the defeat of Samori by the French and the stability and security it brought is contained in an address from the Muslims of Kohogo to the people of Mecca, written during the 1914 to 1918 war. It reads in part, "Whoever does not wish to see the French in our colony, Ivory Coast, is also held in contempt by us Muslims, since our prosperity depends entirely on the arrival of these latter in our colonies. It is moreover thanks to the French that we are spared the ravages and pillages of Samori, slavery and wars between one village and another. At present, we are free, we can live, work in peace, and perform our prayers in tranquility." Yves Persson, and most other Western observers, seek to downplay the religious nature of Samori's campaigns by referring to the fact that the French attributed his followers' courage not to any determination to conquer in the name of Islam or to defend the faith, but to their belief in and awe of their leader. This argument, in our view, is rather shallow because if one were to judge the religiosity of the other jihad movements by looking at the motives of the fighters, then one could easily end up with similar conclusions. As M.G. Smith comments on the nature of the jihad tradition in general, and that of Danfodio in particular, where religious scruples obstruct effective political action, the jihad will normally fail. In other words, non-religious mundane considerations contributed to the successes of the jihad movements. Nevertheless, the extra religious dimension does not in any way negate the underlying source of inspiration for the jihad movements, namely Islamic religious considerations. The secular and mundane were as important as, and indeed inseparable from, the religious. In any case, had Samori been literate, or had his cause any systematic ideologues like those of Danfodio and Al-Hajj Umar, his story could hardly have been any different. Interpreting the jihad tradition in Africa. Interpretation of the jihad legacies in sub-Saharan Africa has, for various reasons, been fraught with difficulties. The reasons for these include, as we have suggested above, the very broad nature of the doctrine of jihad itself. But even more importantly, interpretation of the jihad legacy in present-day West Africa has been heavily vitiated by the politicization of the subject. as perceptively pointed out by Julie Lawson. The writing of northern Nigerian history has been a politicized activity from the outset, from the histories written by the jihadists through to those of the colonialists, the decolonialists, and so on, up to the Islamists and Marxists of the 1980s. Most of the jihadist writings were undertaken during or after their campaigns and, as we have already pointed out above, were in response to criticism from their fellow religionists who questioned and condemned their actions. These writings are, therefore, in a very large measure, post-jihad apologia, representing the jihadist version of the story. The writings of the jihadists, therefore, sought to portray the systems they overthrew as pagan, un-Islamic, unjust, and evil. The colonialist version, written during British conquest and colonial rule in northern Nigeria between 1904 and 1960, also in an apparent attempt to justify their imperial motives, dismissed religion as a pretext for Fulani nationalism and described the decaying, backward, and bankrupt system overthrown by the British. Then followed the interpretations of the decolonialists, who sought to challenge and dismiss the colonialist representations. The decolonialist trend, championed and dominated by H.F.C. Smith, in its attempt to reverse the colonialist stereotype, focused their attention rather uncritically on the works of the jihadists, believing their approach to be from the inside African perspective as opposed to the external conqueror's perspective of the colonialist. Lewis Brenner and Moray Last rather lamely point out in conversation with Julie Lawson that research on the history of jihad movements was restricted because there was considerable pressure from the authorities who, after all, controlled access to both the resources that could be spent on education and frequently to the sources themselves, in the form of documents and permission to conduct oral research. So here we have a clear admission that much of the discourses that came to dominate the history of the jihad movements, in particular, and Islam in West Africa in general, was not only exclusively constructed from the jihadists and therefore Muslim sources, but selected and controlled sources at that. This serious academic limitation was only belatedly acknowledged after one-sided, selective, romantic pictures had been painted and taken root. In fact, field work carried out by decolonialists was in the main at the palaces of local Muslim rulers. Moray Last's chief oral informant was the Vizier of Sokoto at the time, Al-Hajj Junaidu. Mervyn Hiskett, on his part, talks of having received much help and kindness from Madaki, Malam Al-Haji Ahmad in Kano, and in Sokoto from the Waziri, Malam Al-Haji Junaidu. It is clear from the above that despite the belated claims of control of sources, the much help and kindness lavished on these scholars played an important part in compromising their academic objectivity. Perhaps scholars should take note of an Arab proverb which states that the worst of scholars is the one who visits princes, and the best of princes is he who visits scholars. The end result of this uncritical and politicized approach was that the Caliphate and the C-19th was presented as a monolithic construction, 100 years of good progressive Islamic government, thereby distorting the historical picture in favor of the jihad movements. The romantic and one-sided approach of the decolonialists has since dominated and influenced the greater part of post-colonial Muslim and Western discourse on Islam in tropical Africa in general, and the histories of the jihad movements in particular. In fact, these interpretations of the jihad movements in no small way helped in shaping the political landscape of post-independence Nigeria. Contemporary Muslim activists such as Ibrahim Suleiman and Umar Abdullahi emerged in the 1980s and succeeded in transmogrifying the monolithic and romantic version into claims about the Islamic destinies of Africa in general and Nigeria in particular. Their main aim is to rediscover and re-establish the jihadist version of Islam. Also, in the 1970s and early 1980s, attempts were made by the Hausa Muslim victims of the Fulani Jihad to question the monolithic and romantic version of the jihad legacy. The main aim of this trend is to restore the hitherto vilified Hausa system that was overthrown by the Fulani jihadists. Their central argument is that, contrary to claims by the jihadists and their admirers, the Hausa were good Muslims before the Fulani intervention. But, as pointed out by Hiskett, these somewhat unconventional interpretations of the jihad tradition have had little impact, if any, on Nigerian Muslims. Notwithstanding the above historiographies, an important feature of the jihad tradition in the Western and Central Sudan is, first of all, that they were uprisings of non-kin, stranger Muslim communities against the indigenous, overwhelmingly non-Muslim host communities. This, as far as we are concerned, is the critical dividing line in the jihad movements. There is no evidence that the status of Islam in pre-jihad Hausaland, for existence, was in any way different from what pertained in other parts of the sub-region, namely that, as outlined in the preceding chapter, Islam was largely the religion of migrant communities and a royal cult for traditional rulers in the midst of overwhelming indigenous traditional African peasant communities. In fact, Trimingham makes the point very explicitly on the state of Islam in pre-jihad Hausaland. He writes that Islam was only practiced by foreign communities settled in the towns, and a few even of the rulers made a profession of Islam. The relative ease with which the non-kin Fulani conquered Hausaland, for instance, is largely explained, as Trimingham informs us, by the ravages of Gobir and perpetual hostilities between the Hausa states. The hostility between non-kin migrant Muslim communities and the indigenous host communities was further exacerbated by the mutually conflicting interest of the largely nomadic Muslim Fulani, for instance, and the largely peasant, non-Muslim indigenous communities. The opposition between migrant Muslim and indigenous communities was, however, always tied up with other bonds and alignments, such as kinship, ethnic identity, differing understanding of Islam amongst Muslims, political resentments and loyalties, calculations of personal and collective advantages, communal solidarities and antagonisms, etc. The fact, nevertheless, remains that the jihad movements were almost entirely initiated and led by Fulbe and Tukulor, Muslim divines, except that of Samori Toure, against other ethnic communities and their supporters. This led some observers such as J.S. Trimingham to opine that the preaching of the jihad movements was carried out in such a way that it almost became a racial as well as religious war, behind which lay a class struggle between the Torodbe clerical class and the ruling classes. These assessments are true to a large extent when viewed against the background of what has been said in the preceding chapter on the rising influence of the Muslim divines in tropical Africa and their controlled involvement in socio-political affairs. However, the Pan-Fulani theory, be it in terms of race or religion, has a number of shortcomings. This is especially so with regard to the conflicting allegiances and interests that ran through all the jihad movements between and among supporters and opponents alike. First, the thesis of Pan-Fulani nationalism fails to take into account that the Yandoto Ulama, who opposed the jihad, had some prominent Fulani leaders, and here neither religious nor ethnic affinity convinced them to join the jihad. This meant intra-Fulani feuds between those of Danfodio's own clan on the one hand, and the Fulani of Western Katsina on the other. The second factor that makes the Pan-Fulani theory weak is the support of the jihad movements by non-Fulani, who surely had interests other than Fulani nationalism. Nevertheless, the leadership of the new dynasties remained exclusively in the hands of the Fulani, who regarded membership of the new orders more in tribal than religious terms. They despised the non-Fulani, even if they are learned, pious or mujahidun. In other words, the conquered people groups would have seen the jihad movements as nothing short of Fulani imperialism. As can be deduced from the foregoing, the second key feature of the jihad movement is that they were carried out solely by African Muslim groups as a religious duty. It was not an external Muslim force, like Arabs or Berbers, coming down to wage jihad and convert black Africans. And as indicated above, the jihad campaigns during the latter part of the 19th and earlier parts of the 20th centuries were mostly halted by European forces who were out to stop the slave trade and create an atmosphere conducive for their own political and commercial interests. Most of the jihad leaders like Al-Hajj Umar, Samori Toure, and others in their campaigns came into direct confrontation with the French and the British. In this connection, the jihad movements became an African Muslim confrontation with foreign, European, non-Muslim powers. This situation has led some observers to opine that the jihad campaigns are indicative of Islam, unlike Christianity, instilling in the African a sense of superior manliness and an affirmation of the harder warrior values of Africa by offering Africans the word and the sword for defense against external forces as opposed to the servile, docile, and feminine virtues of Christianity. Writing on the impact of jihad in the Senegambian society, an African Muslim observer makes the same assertion in the following words. It goes without saying that such a national consciousness was never obvious amongst the African tribes before the spread of Islam. It was this natural consciousness that helped to rally West African Muslims to fight against colonial forces, which led eventually to some national independence during the 1950s and 1960s. This view is supported by the very fact that Al-Haji Omar Al-Futi was the first African Muslim leader to clash with the European colonial forces. The banner of his resistance to foreign domination was carried on by other Muslim leaders in various parts of the region. In other words, the jihad campaigns, in the view of these observers, were African nationalist movements against European invasion. In this regard, another African Muslim scholar described the European intervention and the subsequent halting of the jihad campaigns as a tragic experience and a European blunder in Africa. The association of the jihad tradition with African nationalism, on the one hand, and European intervention in halting it with imperialism, on the other, are, however, simplistic. In the next section, we shall examine the expressed views and implemented policies of the jihadists toward indigenous Africans and things African. While our aim is not to discuss the relationship between European and Muslim interests in Africa, assertions that European intervention was tragic and a blunder can only be taken as representing the views of the inheritors of the jihad legacy. It is a well-established fact that Islam made more progress in tropical Africa during the relatively brief colonial period than it did in its previous 12 centuries. And so the European intervention, with all its shortcomings and controls, could not have been altogether tragic. This is even more so for Muslims and non-Muslims who suffered the brunt of the jihad campaigns, and for whom the jihad movements were the worst of tragedies, and not just blunders. An old Hausa Muslim lady, Baba of Kano, recounting the British intervention in northern Nigeria, had this to say. We Habe wanted them to come. It was the Fulani who did not like it. When the Europeans came, the Habe saw that if you worked for them, they paid you for it. They didn't say, like the Fulani, commoner, give me this. Commoner, bring me that. Yes, the Habe wanted them. They saw no harm in them. As the statement makes clear, as far as the conquered, exploited and oppressed non-Fulani Muslims and non-Muslims were and still are concerned, the European intervention was regarded as God-sent. This was especially so for the vast non-Muslim indigenous communities who became the main target of Muslim slave raiding, plunder and slaughter during the jihad period. The jihad was and may still be regarded and cherished as manly within some Muslim circles, but as far as the peasant indigenous African and his or her social, religious and political values were concerned, it was physical and cultural brutalization in the name of God. Julie Lawson is therefore right in pointing out that the African and monolithic interpretations of the jihad movements are political histories concerned with events rather than structures, and the elite rather than the people. The third, and perhaps most important feature of the jihad tradition in tropical Africa is that the jihadists all claim to be reformists, aimed at purifying Islam from indigenous pagan accretions. In fact, this is the official Muslim view, particularly with regard to the jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio. Dan Fodio, in the words of Amadou Bello, declared a holy war against the polluters of the faith, starting with the chief of Gobir, one of the worst offenders, in whose territory he was living. This view is paramount in all post-jihad Muslim apologia attributed to Dan Fodio and his immediate successors, modern Muslim sympathizers and admirers of the jihad tradition, plus a host of post-colonial Western observers. Leaders of the jihad tradition have therefore been widely acclaimed as champions of orthodox, normative, and pure Islam, as opposed to their Muslim opponents who represented mixed, compromised, and heterodox Islam. They have also been perceived as more learned in Islam than their contemporaries, if not the best in the history of Islam in tropical Africa. The issue of pure, normative, or orthodox Islam, as opposed to mixed, popular, or contaminated Islam, will be specifically addressed in Chapter 5. What is to be noted here, though, is that the reformist theory of the jihad movements has some inherent difficulties. First of all, if there is anything like Sunni Islamic orthodoxy, then there is an apparent doctrinal difficulty in maintaining that the jihadist campaigns were aimed at reforming Islam, while at the same time referring to these campaigns as jihad. Al-Bakai certainly had the weight of mainstream Islamic thinking on his side when he pointed out that even though it is legitimate to fight to enforce the Sharia, such fighting cannot technically be dubbed a jihad. This was a feature of Khawarij thought, as observed earlier in this chapter. In fact, Mervyn Hiskett, who describes al-Makili's views as Makili fundamentalism, points out that Danfodio owed many of his reformist ideas to the former, quoting extensively from his writings and refers constantly to his opinions. Al-Makili's influence on Danfodio's thought and actions included such crucial areas as the position of the Muslim sinner. The former's ruling against Sonny Ali and his supporters and his legitimizing of jihad against them became the standard model for Danfodio and other West African jihadists. These rulings, though, were passed without any fixed definitions for sin and unbelief, and were therefore clearly subjective. It is precisely because of the risk of this subjectivity that mainline Sunni Islam, in the face of early Khawarij fundamentalism, opted for postponement, Morija, leaving the judgment in such matters to God. The impact of al-Makili's ruling made it possible to regard any professing Muslim as an unbeliever, and thus a fit victim for jihad, a convenient state of affairs for those who wish to usurp power from fellow Muslim rulers by dint of arms. Thus, by anathematizing his fellow Muslim unbelievers, one can say, as far as established mainline Sunni position on this subject is concerned, Danfodio's teachings and actions were just as fundamentalist, if not heterodox, as his inspirer, al-Makili. In addition, granted that there was corruption of belief in 19th century Hausaland, and that there was a need for a revolution to purge Islam and restore orthodoxy by way of reinforcing the Sharia, again, mainline Sunni Muslim teaching does not sanction such an action as jihad. For, to quote al-Bakai once more, jihad is to be strictly limited to fighting of infidels. It is the tyrant Muslims who are to be fought in order that the Sharia become established, and such fighting cannot be recognized as jihad. And the person who dies in the participation in such activity will not receive the honors of a martyr in jihad. So if the jihadists were reformers, as their Western and Muslim apologists would have us believe, then their actions do not qualify to be called jihad. Tajdid, or reform, and jihad cannot be one and the same thing as far as our understanding of mainline Sunni Islamic thought is concerned. Danfodio and his colleagues were therefore neither reformers or jihadists. They could not have been both. It is in these grey areas of doctrinal controversies that non-Muslim observers have to exercise academic sobriety and integrity and abstain from getting involved in these purely intra-Muslim matters. It is academically unsound for a non-Muslim to depict the jihadists as representatives of orthodoxy, by implication subscribing to the idea that all other well-meaning Muslims who opposed their teaching and actions were ignorant charlatans and venal compromisers. Upon what objective basis can an outsider make such categorizations? Nehemiah Letzion, who categorizes African Muslims into true Muslims, unqualified Muslims, and not complete Muslims, admits that it is upon the standards set by the ulama that he defines what he called normative Islam. The term ulama, though, is used loosely, as if it applied to a coherent group of religious professionals. And by declaring the jihadists to be representatives of Islamic orthodoxy in Africa, We are by implication suggesting that all the other eminent Muslim scholars who took exception of the jihadist view are representatives of heterodoxy. As pointed out above, both the jihadists and their Muslim opponents had Islamic reference points. Indeed, as noted by Fazlur Rahman, there has hardly been a consensus among Muslim ulama on any given subject, not even on the doctrine of consensus, ijma itself. There is no doubt that the history of the jihad movement, especially in the discourses of the decolonialists, is the verdict of the victors built upon the ashes of the evidence of the vanquished. Indeed, not only were research sources controlled by local authorities in post-colonial times, but in their bid to exterminate all traces of the conquered, the Fulani conquerors of northern Nigeria, and in all probability other areas in which the jihad tradition had successes, even if temporarily, right from the outset of their campaigns, encouraged and purposely destroyed local chronicles and historical documents. History is replete with examples to show that, but for the fact that the jihadists emerged victorious in their campaigns, they would probably have gone down in history as a rebellious band of renegades, like the Khawarij, who tried to usurp power through un-Islamic means. The point we are making here is that claims that the jihadists are the best representatives of Islamic orthodoxy in sub-Saharan Africa are unsustainable, especially when advanced or echoed by outside observers. If by orthodoxy we mean the views of the victors over against those of the vanquished, for that is what, in actual fact, orthodoxy, both in Islam and Christianity, means, then the claim is valid. But if orthodoxy is taken to mean truth and purity, or even faithful adherence to established tradition, then the claims are difficult to sustain, to put it mildly. As outsiders, it is important to acknowledge the views that Muslims express about their co-religionists, but it is even more important to present those views without appropriating terminologies and vocabularies of the protagonists as if they were our own. Third, and perhaps more importantly, the view that the 18th and 19th century jihad movements were reformist has sometimes left the impression that the conflicts were largely, if not entirely, an intra-Muslim affair. As we have made clear in numerous instances above, there is no doubt that the jihad campaigns had an intra-Muslim dimension. These include the confrontations between Dan Fodio and the Yandoto Muslim ulama, Al-Hajj Umar, and the Masina Muslim community, and Samori and the Muslim communities of northeastern Ivory Coast. It was this intra-Muslim dimension that exercised the jihadists and their fellow Muslim protagonists into writing the treatises that have since attracted and indeed distracted the attention of most observers. The intra-Muslim dimension notwithstanding, the main goal of the jihadists has been succinctly expressed by Mohammed Bello in the following words: "May God help us to pluck up the tents of the heathen from our lands and set up the tents of the law." Indeed, it was in the attacks and destruction of traditional non-Muslim communities that lay the strength and appeal of the jihad movements. As already pointed out above, the jihadists' cardinal charges against their fellow Muslim protagonists, Sokoto jihadists against Al-Kanimi and Umar against Al-Bakai, was that they failed to carry out jihad against surrounding traditional African believers. Umar's main initial aim, as observed above, was therefore to attack and convert the autochthonous non-Muslim people of the Mandinka and Bambara. Umar wrote to his Masina Muslim opponents that every one of us should fight the infidels nearest to him. We should become one hand against the enemies of Allah, our enemies, the enemies of our ancestors. This he did with spectacular results and won wide acclaim from West and North African Muslims. David Robinson, who has researched and written extensively on the jihad campaigns of Umar Tal and many others in the region, is of no doubt that the highest priority for the militant Muslim leader was the destruction of paganism, and especially those ruling dynasties who had gone against the tide of West African history by establishing pagan states and priesthoods in the 18th and 19th centuries. Robinson goes on to sum up Umar's main objective and achievements during the early phase of his jihad in the following words: Umar took as his special obligation the destruction of the Mandika state of Tamba and the Bambara courts of Kata and Segu, which served as a stigma on the body of West African Islam. Much of the excitement among West and North African Muslims at the conquest of Segu in 1861 stemmed from the destruction of this capital of paganism, and much of the respect Umar's son Amadou enjoyed during his reign in the late 19th century stemmed from the fact that he had built a capital of Islam on the cinders of the pagan center. Sokoto, the capital of militant Islam in the central Sudan, was a new city, which began as a military camp. Segu, the capital of militant Islam in the western Sudan, was a transformed pagan site whose national shrines had been publicly destroyed and where the new Islamic palaces had been constructed. The situation in the central Sudan was no different. Even if Uthman Dan Fodio started his jihad against the Muslim ruling class of Gobir. First of all, to paint the Hausa Fulani confrontations as an intra-Muslim affair is to give the impression that the Hausa were overwhelmingly, if not entirely, Muslim. That the pre-jihad Hausa were overwhelmingly traditional believers is supported by facts on the ground. As we have already observed above, a few of the Hausa ruling class subscribed to Islam, but the overwhelming majority of the population remained attached to their traditional religious beliefs. In fact, in some cases, traditional and Muslim rulers alternated in many Hausa states. In Zaria, for instance, Jatau, 1782 to 1802, is known to have been a Muslim, but his son, Makau, who succeeded him, was a practicing traditional believer and upon succession demolished the mosque his father had built. It was after the conquest of Zaria by a jihadist expedition in 1804 that the conversion of the people started. The overthrown ruling class took refuge among the Gwari, where it is well known that, at least, the first refugee chiefs continued with their traditional religious practices. Heinrich Barth, described by Hiskit as an uncommitted observer, visited the region from 1850 to 1854, and in his observations noted that it is evident that the larger portion of the population all over Hausa, especially that of the country towns and villages, remained addicted to paganism till the fanatic zeal of their conquerors, the Fulbe, forced them to profess Islam, at least publicly. Apart from traditional Hausa, who were converted by dint of arms of the jihadists, other traditional Hausa groups who were conquered by the Fulani but treated as tribute-paying cultivators, the Maguzawa, consisted more than half the total Hausa population at the time of British intervention in 1904. And as late as the early 1950s, there were still large blocks of animus between Sokoto and Katsina. All these confirm that the vast majority of pre-jihad Hausas, whom the jihadists fought and subjugated, were traditional believers, and so the jihad was far from an intra-Muslim conflict. Second, the intra-Muslim theory arises from the fact that most discussion on the jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio and his successors tended to be focused mainly, if not exclusively, on the Hausa Fulani wars. This has largely excluded the vast numbers of neighboring non-Hausa people groups who were entirely traditional African believers on whom the jihad fell much more heavily. These included the Bura and Pabir people of Bornu province, as well as the Batonbu and the Zugwe, who had professing Muslim chiefs, while the population remained almost exclusively traditional believers. And other areas such as Bauchi, Gombe, Katagum, Misau, and Jamari on the plateau, plus Kefi, Nasarawa, Lafia, Doma, and Kiana in the Benue area. Adamawa Emirate, which was founded by one Modibo Adama, who received the Blessed Flag from Danfodio in 1806 and launched his jihad in 1809, was carved out of traditional people groups in the region. Non-Muslim indigenous people groups, who were the principal victims of Adama's campaigns, included the Fali, Mufu, Daba, Mundang, Vere, Chamba, Namchi, Doni, Longuda, Marki, Mumuye, Kilba, Bata, Mambila, etc. Local Muslim chronicles affirm this fact by stating that Adama, as opposed to many of his contemporaries, conducted his jihad against pagan tribes for the faith, not to capture slaves and fill his harems. Heinrich Barth, in his account, talks of how incessant Muslim Fulani and Tuareg campaigns reduced former populous, stable and prosperous non-Muslim communities to a condition of utmost misery and insecurity. The many emirates that were formed throughout present-day northern Nigeria were carved out of areas previously inhabited by traditional African communities. Abdullahi Danfodio, brother of Uthman Danfodio, undertook a series of campaigns against non-Hausa traditional people groups like the Gurma and the Dibe in Tanda, Fas, Jama, Sanbalgo, Jarori, and Nupeland. He succeeded in conquering these areas and founded that part of the caliphate purely on pagan land. The emirs of Zaria and Kontagora are also known to have laid waste vast areas of land previously inhabited by indigenous African communities. The once great traditional Gwari tribe were the chief victims in the founding of Kontagora as a Muslim town. Writing on the relationship between the Sokoto Caliphate and the non-Muslim peoples of the Middle Benue region, T. Makar states his main purpose as an assessment of how successfully the Sokoto Caliphate emirs, whose territory lay close or had a common frontier with the non-Muslim people, were able to fulfill one of their most important religious duties, i.e. jihad in the Benue area, as contained in their letters of appointment. Makar then goes on to outline the campaigns undertaken by different emirs against various indigenous non-Muslim communities and concludes that the relationship between the emirates and the non-Muslim peoples was characterized by wars, which were partly to extend the political influence of the individual rulers, or emirs. The waging of holy war against traditional African communities was always explicitly stated in the appointment letters of emirs, and the jihad movement subjected traditional African communities to unimaginable brutality. In some instances, the brutality inflicted upon traditional communities is relayed with some chilling details. The following example is reported on the terror inflicted on the indigenous Montagnard people groups by Haman Yaji, a particularly ruthless Muslim jihadist, 1912 to 1927, of a small territory, Madagali, in northeastern Adamawa state of Nigeria. On one raid, Haman Yaji's soldiers cut off the heads of the dead pagans in front of the palace, threw them into a hole in the ground, set them alight, and cooked their food over the flames. Another time they forced their wives of the dead men to come forward and collect their husbands' heads in a kabalash. One witness told me how he had seen children have a coil of wire hammered through their ears and jaws by the soldiers, while another related how, when Haman Yaji learned of the great significance attached to the Sakur, a subclan of Montagnard, burial rites, he ordered his troops to cut up the bodies of the dead so that they could not be given a decent burial. The people groups of the middle belt of Nigeria remain traditional believers despite, or rather because of, incessant Hausa Fulani Muslim raids in the name of jihad. These militant campaigns against traditional people groups continued well into the late 1950s, especially in the middle belt of Nigeria, where campaigns were conducted against the Kilba people and others, with the British colonial administration turning a blind eye on the raids. It is these Muslim campaigns against traditional African communities in the sub-region that S.S. Nyang refers to approvingly as two processes of detraditionalization and Islamization, where success of Muslims in many areas of the West Sudan led to the gradual destruction of the traditional cults and the emasculation of the old aristocracy. In fact, Danfodio, right from the beginning of his reform movement, considered military jihad against the vast numbers of traditional communities in the region to be a top priority. In his Kitab al-Faq, Danfodio states the obligations of a Muslim ruler, in contrast to pagan rulers, as stripping of evil things and introducing reforms into religious and temporal affairs. He goes on to declare, "And an example of stripping evil things from religious and temporal affairs is that every governor of a province should strive to fortify strongholds and wage holy war against the unbelievers, and the war makers, and the oppressors, and forbid every disapproved thing. The unbelievers, i.e. traditional African believers, are here deliberately distinguished from enemy Muslim and or non-Muslim states, war makers, and oppressive Muslim rulers. The reform the jihadist sought to bring about was not therefore merely getting rid of un-Islamic practices and elements or to purify Islam and restore orthodoxy, but even more so to inject fresh dynamism into the propagation of the religion in the sub-region, which, as we have shown in preceding discussions, had remained the religion of stranger communities and an aristocratic cult. This new dynamism was the invocation of holy war against traditional African believers, sanctioned by the Quran and mainline Muslim teaching. The reformist program of the jihadists was therefore not simply a question of Muslims washing their dirty linen in public, but involved tackling the root cause of the dirt, i.e., the traditional African social, religious, and political symbols and structures, and their custodians and practitioners. Both the jihadists and their Muslim opponents had little disagreement on embarking upon jihad against traditional African believers. For this reason, Muslim scholars who opposed the jihad were careful to argue their case along lines other than the intrinsic value of the traditional African as a good pagan who should be left to hold on to his or her religious beliefs. The abiding principle of the opposition to the jihad by such leading Muslim scholars of the time as Al-Kanimi was that the abandonment of the unbeliever is more acceptable than the killing of a Muslim. The issue here is the spilling of fellow Muslim blood. Indeed, Al-Kanimi referred to ordinary traditional Africans in Bornu as kawalib, or dogs, who may be spared as potential source of booty. Al-Bakai, on his part, had no doubt that jihad is to be strictly limited to fighting infidels, i.e., traditional African believers. Likewise, contemporary Nigerian Muslim scholars who questioned the assumptions and allegations of the jihadists against the pre-jihad Hausa do not take a dispassionate view of, let alone laud, the non-Muslim past. Indeed, for the most part they reject it with the same vigor as the protagonists of the reform movement. Their argument is not that the pre-jihad Hausa were commendable pagans, forced into Islam by tyrannous Muslim jihadists, which may well be the view of non-Muslim students of the events of the 19th century, but rather that these Hausas were good Muslims long before the jihad was unnecessarily and unjustly inflicted upon them. It is clear from the above that while the jihad movement no doubt involved Muslim-Muslim conflicts throughout the 18th, 19th, and first half of the 20th centuries, traditional African believers were the principal targets and victims of the jihadists. The strenuous attempts by some Western scholars to portray the jihad movements as reform movements can only be attributed to what we may call the bug of postmodernism. Which in its discourse on Islam seeks to deny or avoid everything critical in order to avoid giving the impression that Islam was ever spread by dint of arms. This type of scholarship, in our estimation, is just as detrimental to sustainable interfaith dialogue as the past procedure on which Islam was depicted as a religion of violence that was spread only by the sword. If one contends that 18th and 19th century jihad campaigns were an intra-Muslim affair, one obvious question that begs an answer is whence did the jihadists acquire their slaves in such large numbers that northern Nigeria, for instance, could be described as one of the largest slave societies in modern history? Traditional believers would have certainly constituted an overwhelming proportion of the slave population, and we cannot say slave raids were excesses or abuses of the jihad movements, for as we shall go on to demonstrate in the next section and later in the next chapter, views and policies expressed by the jihadists towards traditional African believers and things traditional were deeply rooted in their understanding of things essentially Islamic and un-Islamic. Jihadist views and the policies towards traditional Africa. The jihadist views and policies towards traditional African believers and things indigenously African were in many ways informed by the believer-unbeliever, Muslim, non-Muslim, and Islam, non-Islam dichotomy in the Quran and Muslim traditions. These were further embellished by the views of Muslim jurists and theologians on what relations should and should not exist between the believer and unbeliever, Muslim and non-Muslim, and Islam and non-Islam. Echoing traditional Muslim teaching on the subject, 18th and 19th century African jihadists were basically of the view that unbelievers, who in their particular context were traditional African believers, were essentially enemies of Muslims. They should not rule over Muslims, they should be fought, killed, enslaved, or subjugated by Muslims. In their mission, the jihadists portrayed the traditional African with whom Muslims had lived for centuries as a representative of Kufr and as such an enemy of God, Muhammad, Islam, and Muslims. To use the words of Umar once more, traditional African believers were the enemies of Allah, the enemies of all the Muslims, our enemies, his enemies, and the enemies of his forefathers. Used countless numbers of times throughout the writings of the ideologues of the jihad tradition, the term enemy is employed as a general ideological term for non-Muslims who in their particular context were traditional African believers. Thus, the traditional African was an enemy of God, Muhammad, and Muslims by virtue of the content of his or her beliefs, customs, and practices, and therefore a legitimate target of jihad. In the opinion of the jihadists and their contemporary Muslim admirers, therefore, the very existence of the non-Muslim in general, and the traditional African believer in particular, is a smear on the dignity of Islam and a potential threat to the interests of Muslims. In his Bayan Wujub, Dan Fodio, after quoting a number of Quranic verses, hadiths, and the works of past scholars, called upon Muslims to emigrate from the land of unbelievers to the land of Islam, that they may attain paradise and be companions to their ancestor Abraham and their prophet Muhammad. In a similar vein, he declared that there should be no friendship, counsel, or living together between an unbeliever and a believer, even if they are blood relations. On the contrary, believers must bear ill will towards them, traditional believers, and fight them on account of their faith. After citing relevant Quranic texts, hadiths, and works of past scholars concerning the fact that unbelievers are to be fought, killed, and their property, children, and women seized as booty, Dan Fodio ruled, "My view is that the unbelievers of the Sudan, traditional African believers, should be treated like the rest of the unbelievers in all respects. The only legitimate relation with traditional believers, in the view of the jihadists, is at best to subjugate and treat them with contempt, or at worst, kill or enslave them." Uthman Dan Fodio's grandson, Saidu Dan Bello, wrote, "Let us thank God, the Lord of the office, the unique, the king who shows no mercy to the unbeliever," and goes on to add, "A man who has no knowledge of Islam, he is a mere creature of the bush, he can have no wish to live among men." Traditional believers, in the view of the jihadists, had no right to rule over Muslims. Muslims should not live under the authority of non-Muslims. Rulership is the divine right of Muslims over non-Muslims, and wherever the former find themselves living under the rule of the latter, they must emigrate, prepare, and launch a jihad against the non-Muslim system. Thus, central to the jihadist twin mission of detraditionalization and Islamization was their passionate struggle to wrest political power from those they considered infidel rulers. The following is Dan Fodio's ruling on the issue. "And that flight, al-hijra, from the land of the heathen is obligatory by assent, and that by assent the status of a town is the status of its ruler. If he be Muslim, the town belongs to Islam, but if he be heathen, the town is a town of heathendom from which flight is obligatory, and that to make war upon the heathen king, who will not say, 'There is no God but Allah,' is obligatory by assent, and that to take the government from him is obligatory by assent, and that to make war upon the heathen king, who does not say, 'There is no God but Allah,' on account of the custom of his town, and who makes no profession of Islam, is also obligatory by assent. The status of a land depending on the Muslimness of its ruler, whose religious status in turn depended on the judgment of the jihadists. Thus, if the ruler is indicted of kufr, the land becomes a legitimate target of jihad, irrespective of the religious makeup of the subjects. On the other hand, a Muslim ruler presiding over a land with pagan subjects could be indicted of kufr by association. Al-Hajj Umar accused Ahmad ibn Ahmad of Masina of tolerating pagan subjects alongside Muslim subjects and referring to them as his pagans and his Muslims. The jihadists had no doubt that in order to carry out the mission of Islam, as they perceived it, political power was vital. In fact, Umar Abdullahi explicitly states that the Sokoto jihad movement was not principally designed to reinforce the spiritual aspects of Islam, but rather its political social aspects. This view appears to be grounded in the traditional Muslim maxim that there is no separation between religion and politics. Hence, the launching of jihad against traditional African communities in West Africa from the 17th right through to the first half of the 20th century with the view of emasculating the old aristocracies. Similarly, the jihadists viewed the indigenous African social, political, and religious values, customs, systems, and structures as un-Islamic and therefore sources of contamination of Islam. Thus, in the words of Umar, wherever they went, their central theme was one and their target was one. That is the total destruction of all customs and traditions that were in conflict with the Sharia. In other words, in northern Nigeria, the Jihad of Danfodio was primarily concerned with exterminating traces of traditional African religious, social, and political values from Islam. Danfodio quoted Muslim authorities to support his view that African arts, in the form of singing, drumming, and dancing, are forbidden in Islam, and declared everything of the ignorant, Ajam, as bidah. One of the many accusations leveled against Hausa rulers by Danfodio was they will not abandon their custom which they found their forebears practicing, even though it is evil. The people of Nioro in Bambara land and many others in the Senegambian region were, in the words of J.R. Willis, caused to sacrifice the memorials of their cultural past to the mercilessness of Al-Hajj Umar. So in their twin mission of detraditionalization and Islamization, the jihadists made the old aristocracies their chief targets and, in effect, demanded immediate and unconditional cultural, political, and socio-religious surrender. In the words of Danfodio, it is incumbent upon the commander of the believers to follow the habits of the Muslims in their governments and to avoid the habits of the unbelievers in their governments. The traditional principles of accommodation and compromise that enhanced mutual acceptance and in fact celebration of diversity, as demonstrated in the preceding chapter, and from which the jihadists themselves rose to prominence, was thrown overboard and an exclusivist and intolerant system imposed. To quote Mervyn Hiskett, the Reformers' society was a closed one in the sense that it deliberately excluded non-Muslims except as slaves or as tribute-paying subjects to the Islamic State. A whole set of limitations and discriminatory restrictions in traditional Muslim jurisprudence aimed at non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim-ruled state were employed by the new rulers which, in effect, relegated non-Muslim subjects to, at best, the status of second-class citizens and at worst, subhumanity. Traditional African believers were not only disenfranchised, but where they were tolerated, they stood very little chance, if any, of obtaining justice at Muslim courts. It has been reported that a Muslim ruler of 19th century northern Nigeria once declared that, "From now on, I shall allow no more uncircumcised people in the courtyard of my palace." In other words, one must circumcise, i.e., become Muslim, in order to seek justice under the new system. It can therefore be said that the jihadists, all with an impeccable African pedigree, were avowedly anti-African. The main motivation for the jihadists' anti-Africanness was their zeal for a prescriptive Islam. All the jihadists called for or claimed to stand for the full enforcement of the Sharia. They were not happy with the superimposition of Islamic religious norms upon traditional African socio-political structures. Neither were they content with Muslims living and practicing their faith freely under non-Islamic rule. Indeed, they regarded the political and legal content of Islam as equally important, if not more so. They regarded the Sharia as divine law, which must be enforced in all its totality. Danfodio charged Hausa rulers for disregarding the application of the laws of God, saying, "One of the ways of their governments is to change the laws of God, and an example of that is that the Sharia decrees that the adulterer shall be flogged if he is not married, and stoned to death if he is married, and that the thief shall have his hand cut off, and that he who kills a person deliberately shall be killed, or if the killing was unintentional, shall be ordered to pay the blood money, which shall be divided among the heirs of the slain man. The Sharia also decrees that one who destroys one of the limbs of the body, a similar limb of his shall be destroyed. And for wounding, it lays down retaliation in as far as retaliation is possible, the compensation where retaliation is not possible." This 7th century Arab penal code was to replace traditional Hausa court practice. Danfodio urged jihadist rulers to see to the scrupulous enforcement of the Sharia, for most of the people are ignorant of the Sharia, and it is obligatory that there should be, in every mosque and quarter in the town, a faqih teaching the people of their religion. In the words of Umar Abdullahi Danfodio, whom he describes as the intellectual schemer and military strategist of the Sokoto jihad movement, has harped in his works on the imperativeness of strict imitation of the companions of the Prophet, especially the rightly guided Khulafa and the worthy ancestors. The Arab factor in Islam, i.e., Arabization, was crucial and central in the jihadist conception of pure Islam. Danfodio and his followers called for the ban on African forms of entertainment, music, and popularized poetry. They anathematized local languages like Hausa as Ajami or profane, and eulogized Arabic as the language of God. They promoted Arab and nomadic ways of dressing, wearing of the veil by women and turban by men, as against traditional Hausa forms. The jihadists not only venerated Arabic language and culture, but deeply longed to be part of it. Abdullahi Danfodio laments to his non-Arab descent and confesses his inferior status thus: a poor slave, ignorant, drowning in a sea of sin, confused in a sea of fantasy, humble, speaking Arabic incorrectly, non-Arab in tribe. Where the jihadists had to write in the vernacular, i.e., in such popular literature as poetry, it served only as an embellishment of the Arabic motif, which they regarded as the preeminent standard of the religious and political life for Muslims. In other words, Reform Islam in Africa pressed for a choice between the old and the new, and although there were gaps, the pressure was toward the Orient in terms of orientation toward Mecca and Medina. On the whole, the jihad tradition of 18th and 19th century Africa aimed at the sacralization of the Arabic cultural milieu, with which Islamic mission is properly identified. The jihadists were therefore just as thorough in their Islamization and Arabization as they were in their detraditionalization. This included vilifying and demonizing traditional believers as enemies of God and Islam, claiming Muslim rule over non-Muslims as a divine right, typecasting African traditions and values as evil and satanic, while upholding Islam in its 7th century Arab scaffoldings as the model. It was through this Islamization and Arabization that the jihadists not only sought for themselves but also upheld as the uncompromising model of Muslim religious orientation in the sub-region. If the views and policies of the jihadists toward traditional African believers were to be espoused by, say, Western Christian missionaries or any group in our present day and age, they would be rightly branded religious fascism. If the campaign against traditional believers were to be carried out in any part of the world today, it would be viewed as religious cleansing, and the massacres that went with it would be first-class genocide. Cultural genocide and religious imperialism would have been the appropriate terms for their programs of Islamization and Arabization had it been undertaken by any other group. But alas, this was not the case. It was Africans mercilessly enforcing Arab ways of life upon fellow Africans in the name of God. Even more so is the fact that these were carried out by a community of people who thought that their case was made in heaven and should not be questioned. What is worrying, though, is that the anti-African, anti-non-Muslim, and anti-non-Islam attitudes of the jihadists, plus their desire to follow the Arab model, far from diminishing, is still alive in varying degrees in contemporary African Muslim thought. The absolute claims of the jihadists in the 18th and 19th centuries have remained the source of inspiration and exemplar model for the overwhelming majority of present-day African Muslims, even if only a few radical but nevertheless influential ones like Ibrahim Sulaiman, Umar Abdullahi, and Mahmoud Gumi are those who publicly articulate these views. We shall explore the various attempts of contemporary Muslims to reenact the jihadist model of Sharia rule in Chapter 5. It should be pointed out, though, that this attraction persists largely due to the myths created in post-colonial discourse on the history of the jihadist rule, especially that of the Sokoto Caliphate of the 19th century northern Nigeria, to the effect that Sharia rule of the jihadists brought about stable and progressive governments as compared to the traditional order that was overthrown, and that the Islamic Revolution did away with injustice and established social justice unparalleled and unknown in the history of Africa. These myths are certainly the source for the nostalgia for the past and uninformed imitation of Arab governance. It is the myths that seek to present the jihadist rule as the golden epoch of Islam in Africa that we now proceed to examine. Evaluating the jihadist Sharia rule. Most post-colonial Muslim and Western assessments of the 18th and 19th century jihadist rule in parts of present-day West and Central Africa have sought to paint a romantic and idealistic picture of the jihadist achievements, implicitly and explicitly suggesting that the lofty ideas set out in the jihadist manifestos were achieved in practice. These are mainly in the area of the jihadist views of an Islamic state, an Islamic government, and Islamic legal systems. Murray Last, in this regard, wrote, "Throughout the 19th century, the ideals, and to a large extent the practice, of Sokoto did not change. This was achieved because the Caliph and his court upheld the traditions of the Shaykh." Ibrahim Suleiman, on his part, makes the same assertion in an even more confident tone. He writes, "We can ask the historians, has there ever been more successful, more integrated, more disciplined states and governments in Africa, and on our own very soil, Nigeria, than the Islamic states and the Islamic governments?" The problem with these assessments, however, is that they are not only based on the histories of the victors, but their programs and manifestos, and to take them at face value is like taking a party political broadcast as evidence of success in government. Some of those like Suleiman and other Muslim activists who laud the jihadist Sharia are not only uncritical, but frequently untrue, omitting anything contentious or difficult, thereby degenerating into propaganda. There is certainly no question that the socio-political, judicial, and intellectual legacies of the jihadists have left an indelible imprint on Islam and Muslim identity in areas with a long and sustained jihad tradition, as northern Nigeria. Muslim religious and political awareness and self-assertion in most parts of Africa, in addition to contemporary global and local factors, are directly and indirectly inspired by the jihad tradition. As far as Islamization is concerned, the jihadist contribution is equally apparent. This is evidence from the demographic distribution of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa in general and West Africa in particular. There is no doubt that Islam is more visible and entrenched in West Africa than East, Central and Southern Africa, and, as is demonstrably clear from the preceding discussion, West Africa felt the impact of military jihad more than any other part of sub-Saharan Africa. Within West Africa itself, Islam is much more manifest in areas with successful jihad traditions like present-day northern Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, northern Chad, etc., while it is less so in areas like Ghana, Togo, Benin, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and Burkina Faso. In other words, the demographic distribution of Islam in the sub-Saharan Africa suggests a correlation with the jihad tradition. Although Lamine Sané has argued that the role of the jihad tradition should not be overestimated in the diffusion of Islam in tropical Africa to the neglect of the less dramatic peaceful diffusion, he himself admits elsewhere that work done in Ghana and evidence gathered from Sierra Leone, to mention a couple of examples, suggests that Islam does not possess the momentum the reformers and the Western scholars they carried along claimed for it. The point here is that indigenous traditions in areas with minimal or no successful jihad campaigns have proved that they can hold Islam at bay. For a possible explanation for the comparative success of Islam in the aforementioned areas, therefore, the jihad tradition is certainly a strong contributory factor. This is mainly due to the fact that the militant Muslim campaigns, though ephemeral, in some ways prepared the ground for the spread of Islam, for by their massacres and slave raiding, accompanied by the destruction of symbols, statuettes, mosques, and ancestor houses, they broke up the old religio-social structure of many peoples, whilst on the positive side, nominal attachment to Islam often led under peaceful conditions to permanent Islamization. The dislocations brought about by the jihad campaigns on traditional communities, among other factors, contributed to the consolidation of Islam in those areas during the more stable and peaceful times of European colonial rule, which coincided with the rise of Sufism and its tremendous appeal to disinherited people groups. Also, in areas where the jihad tradition achieved a measure of success, the commoners were for the first time moving toward Islam, not only because of greater coercion, but because only by becoming Muslims could they again become recognized members of the system. In some cases, the contempt with which traditional believers were regarded and treated by Muslim communities put psychological pressures on people to convert to Islam in northern Nigeria. Traditional believers had no way of ascending the social ladder under Muslim governance. A Hausa proverb has it that farming is a pagan's sole occupation. To be a non-Muslim was therefore a big hindrance in one's socio-political and economic advancement. Even under British colonial administration, besides the ruling class, all native officials were Muslims, and only Muslims were chosen to fill vacant positions in native authorities. So it was only by converting to Islam that traditional communities could gain a modicum of recognition and hopefully find their way into occupations other than farming. Muslim enslavement of traditional African believers during the wake of jihad movements is one single factor that accounts for large-scale conversion to Islam in 18th and 19th century Western and Central Sudan. This fact will be made clear in the next chapter as we produce census figures showing percentages of people of servile origins in Muslim areas. Slaves, gradually and generally, took up the religion of their masters because it is only by becoming Muslim that they could serve their Muslim masters better in observing the relevant dietary and other social religious rites. The mass enslavement of traditional African believers by African, Arab, Turkish and other Muslim societies, as will become apparent in the next chapter, makes the institution of slavery the one factor that accounts for the introduction of Islam of vast numbers of Africans who otherwise would have not come into contact with the religion. At the initial stages, conversions related to the above factors were nominal. There were vast numbers of ordinary people in Sokoto, for instance, who called themselves Muslims but hardly performed the daily liturgical prayers. Mohammed Bello identified 10 groups of people in 19th century Sokoto, with only one group described as real Muslims. The vast majority, according to Bello, hardly observed their prayers. Similarly, instead of producing Muslim rulers with the promotion of Islam as their top priority, the jihad movements, with a few exceptions, brought in its wake a new band of rulers who had interests other than Islamization. Most of the emirs were more interested in raiding and brutalizing neighboring traditional communities than in seeking to convert them to Islam. The jihad campaigns therefore engendered violence and antipathy in non-Muslim areas, and in some cases became stumbling blocks to the conversion of indigenous people. Among the vast majority of the people groups of the middle belt of Nigeria, there emerged and still exists a strong anti-Hausa, Fulani and anti-Islam feeling because of the memories of Muslim slave raiding activities in the area. Among the Longuda, for instance, so strong is the feeling that fellow Longuda who are Muslim are scorned because Islam is seen as a mark of slave descent. They would say, "I am not a slave, that I should do the Salat." In some areas, especially French-administered West African territories, after the jihad campaigns were halted by colonial forces, people reverted in large numbers to their traditional African beliefs. On the question of reform and getting rid of un-Islamic elements from Muslim religious practice, the success of jihadist rule in this regard too was not decisive. Shrines were indeed attacked and destroyed, and indigenous customs demonized as satanic, but the sword of orthodoxy could not get rid of them altogether. Muslim practices point to the fact that traditional religious elements persist. These include the Bori, a Hausa spirit possession cult, the Homtu or Homturu, Hirsi, Dando, seasonal ceremonies of the Wadabi Fulani of northern Nigeria, and a host of others. Singing, drumming, and dancing, all condemned by the jihadists, continued and in fact had to be reinstated by Danfodio, albeit under special circumstances. Also, although Danfodio in his earlier writings declared that it is incumbent upon Muslim rulers to avoid the habits of the unbelievers in their government, the old habits never died easily. Most taxes that were condemned by the jihadists as un-Islamic were retained, and new ones even introduced. For instance, taxes that were levied by Hausa rulers and condemned by Uthman Danfodio, such as the cattle tax, known as Jangali, were retained in addition to new ones that were introduced. The wearing of silk, gold, silver, and other forms of traditional Hausa royal regalia, all of which were strongly condemned by Danfodio in his early manifestos, remained the order of the day. Similarly, the temptation to make use of traditional Hausa titles condemned by Danfodio could not be resisted. Mervyn Hiskett writes, "These prohibitions were clearly never taken seriously, as many of the titles became accepted into the new hierarchy and have persisted to the present day. Indeed, it does not appear that they were observed, even by the generation immediately following the Shehu." Danfodio also condemned the traditional Hausa system of hereditary succession as follows. One of the ways of their government is succession to the emirate by hereditary right and by force to the exclusion of consultation, or shura. Meanwhile, Danfodio himself paved the way for his son, Mohammed Bello, to succeed him as the Sultan of Sokoto. Throughout the Caliphate, accession to the office of Emir in the Emirates remained the preserve of descendants of the original flag bearers. On the whole, therefore, the change of ruling dynasties did not alter the system of administration based on historical tradition and Islamic culture. The emergent political and administrative system merely changed from those of ephemeral Muslim Hausa dynasties to those of ephemeral Muslim Fulani dynasties. The enslavement of free people, i.e. Muslims, continued and indeed escalated throughout the 19th century, despite the fact that it constituted one of the emotive charges leveled against the old Hausa ruling class by Danfodio in his works. Baba of Kano talks of continued indiscriminate raids of her people, the Hausa, and the enslavement of her relatives, irrespective of the fact that they were Muslims. Corruption, materialism, extortion, oppression, and abuse of power became commonplace. A Fulfulde proverb bears witness to the degenerative effect of the jihad movements thus. The cleric begets a chief. The chief begets an infidel. This trend of degeneration, pillage and devastation perpetuated by most of the new Muslim Fulani leadership, coupled with European presence, was interpreted by Muslims in the Senegambian and Niger Bend region of West Africa as signs of the end times. Most of them migrated eastwards into the Niger-Chad region in anticipation of the appearance of the Mahdi. So disappointing were the realities of jihadist Sharia rule, judged against their own ideals, that 4 years after the Sokoto jihad was launched, Abdullahi Danfodio became disillusioned and momentarily abandoned the cause. In a poem, Abdullahi lamented thus, "When my sincere friends died, our goals were lost. I was left behind in the midst of liars who claimed that which they did not do, pursued their whims, and chased rapacity in preference to what was obligatory on them, devouring people's wealth, self-gratification, booty and bribery, enjoyment of lutes, flutes, and the beating of drums. They have also sold free persons into slavery in the market. Some of them appear as judges but are wolves in the garb of foxes." In another poem, Abdullahi Danfodio makes an almost identical indictment thus, "I am now left in the midst of liars and hypocrites who say one thing and do entirely another. People whose preoccupation is attainment of political power for the procurement of sensual comfort through concubines, flutists, gorgeous clothing, and brisk horses." In fact, Mervyn Hiskett could not but admit that the Fulani administration tended to slip back to the old Hausa norms, but then quickly went on to suggest that an important aspect of the reformers' achievement is the critical way the society tends to react to such backsliding. In other words, it is thanks to the legacy of the jihad movements that critical voices always emerge to challenge and call people back to the proper observance of Islamic practices. That might be the case, but this does not still deny the fact that the rule of the jihadists was a far cry from the glorious past being claimed for it. As far as the judicial system is concerned, the jihadists certainly made the idea of the Sharia very popular in theory, but it was quite another matter in practice. Judging from the words of such pivotal personalities of the jihad tradition as Abdullahi Danfodio and contemporary admirers of the jihadist model, one is inclined to suggest that while the jihadists definitely had lofty ideas regarding the Sharia, the application and implementation appear to have been doomed right from the start. According to Umar Abdullahi, it was the question of the application, or otherwise, of the Sharia that caused Abdullahi Danfodio's frustration and disillusionment with the vast majority of his contemporaries, including Uthman Danfodio, and was the main source of his disagreement with them. In Umar Abdullahi's words, "The principal goal of the Sharia is, among others, to make people honest, temperate, disciplined, sincere, and decent by way of imitating the deeds of companions, especially the rightfully guided Khalifa and the worthy ancestors. But within 4 years of the initial successful establishment of the Caliphal administration, some Muhajidun betrayed the aims and ideals of the jihad. Most jihadist rulers were just as guilty of changing the laws of God, a charge Danfodio leveled against pre-jihad Hausa rulers. Describing the degenerative and dysfunctional effect of the Sharia in 20th century Sokoto in graphic and somber detail, F. L. Shaw recounts that the tyranny and judicial abuses in the system were only tempered by the weakness or moderation of individual rulers. She writes about alkalis, local Muslim judges, being either disregarded by local rulers, overruled by emirs, or worse still, subjected to the authority of the emir's favorite slaves, who decreed to their enemies inhuman punishments of their own invention. Some of these inventions included the tearing out of nails with red-hot pincers, pounding of limbs one by one in a mortar while the victims were still alive, and for important offenders to be built alive gradually into town walls until their head was finally walled up. A good number of the walls of Hausa towns, according to Shaw, are known locally and called by the names of the victims whose corpses they contain. Impalement and mutilation were the lesser penalties for less grievous offences. Mervyn Hiskett argues that the fact that the British recognised and retained the Sharia courts as part of their policy of indirect rule in northern Nigeria is evidence of their importance and therefore a success story of the jihad tradition. This argument, though, is not entirely convincing. The British sanctioned the Islamic judicial system in northern Nigeria and other parts of Africa, not because the system was unique and therefore of special importance, but as part of the Native Authority Ordinance, which recognized the native law and custom prevailing in an area. This policy applied to non-Muslim judicial systems as it did to the Sharia courts of Muslims. Moreover, the recognition of the British does not necessarily mean the application and implementation of the Sharia was up to the standard claimed by the jihadist manifestos. From the preceding discussion, some interesting features emerge about the thought pattern of Danfodio that we wish to point out. In the first phase, we have Danfodio, the teacher, as a moderate, criticizing those who held austere and prescriptive views of Islam, including his own teacher. He criticized certain Fulbe ulama for making knowledge of the Kabe, a translation and adaptation of classic Islamic texts and commentaries in Fulfulde, the measuring rod of being a good Muslim. Danfodio advocated taqlid, unquestioning imitation of the local ulama for ordinary Muslims. In other words, Danfodio the teacher was, as in the nature of all good teachers, understanding and less severe with ordinary Muslims. In the second phase, we have Danfodio the preacher, in opposition to the Hausa establishment, who then became idealistic and espoused monolithic, exclusivist, puritanical, intolerant, and even militant Islam. He succeeded in declaring other Muslims unbelievers for failing to perceive things the way he perceived them, and launched a militant movement to overthrow the old system and try to implement his religio-political manifestos. Throughout this period, Danfodio saw things as either black or white. In the third phase, we have Danfodio in power, who appears to have become more pragmatic and realistic and began to tone down, reinstating things he had hitherto condemned and falling back on some of the policies of the former regime. It is this evolution in Danfodio's thought pattern that F.H. El-Masri sees, and he claims Danfodio lacked the power of critical analysis in his approach to problems. But rather than seeing this as lacking the power of critical analysis, when we look at Danfodio in the different roles we have just outlined above, the stances he took in fulfilling them can be seen as consistent and nothing out of the ordinary. For we know good teachers are considerate, good preachers are supposed to be the conscience of states and therefore have to be critical wherever the need arises. Opposition leaders are idealistic and think they have all the answers, while those in power know only too well how crucial the art of pragmatism is. It is only when all these roles are confused and combined together, as they were in Danfodio, that contradictions and inconsistencies become inevitable. Conclusion. In this chapter, we have taken the analysis of the interaction between Arab Islam and Black Africa forward by looking at military jihad, which in the view of some Muslim groups was the only way to overthrow and completely overhaul the indigenous host environment. Despite the ambiguous nature of the doctrine of jihad, as far as the African jihadists were concerned, the move was not at all new. It is, in point of fact, profoundly rooted in the Islamic tradition. There was equally no doubt about the purpose of jihad, namely, exalting and promoting Islam for the benefit of humanity in general. In seeking to exalt and promote Islam, the jihadists had to subdue the traditional African environment, its people, and worldview by dint of arms. Traditional Africans and their socio-religious and political symbols and structures therefore became the principal targets of the jihadists. In their task, the jihadists had the twin program of detraditionalization and Islamization, the latter part of which involved the imposition of Islam in its 7th century Arab cultural scaffoldings. On detraditionalization, despite the untold suffering and irrevocable blows meted out to indigenous African religious practitioners, symbols and socio-political institutions, the jihadists did not succeed in destroying the intrinsic appeal of some socio-religious African values and rituals. On Islamization, they achieved a measure of success in that their campaigns helped in no small way in moving Islam from the periphery to the center stage of African experience in jihad-affected parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The realities on the ground show, however, that the jihadist Sharia rule was far from successful and that on the whole, jihadist rule tended to slip back into the old systems they overthrew.